Hi everyone, if you're interested in the Bronze Age, then you've probably heard of the Bronze Age collapse, which is when numerous major civilizations around the Eastern Mediterranean suddenly fell into a sharp, dramatic decline, or in other words, they collapsed. So this was a major event which completely changed the whole dynamic of the Eastern Mediterranean, and that area entered what's called the Dark Ages. Not the medieval Dark Ages, but the early Iron Age Dark Ages. So there's a really common belief that this was caused by the Sea Peoples. So the Sea Peoples are famously a mysterious group of nations who were active in that area at the time of the Bronze Age collapse. They're particularly famous for attacking Egypt, and eventually the Egyptians defeated them in about 1180 or 1170. But they didn't just attack Egypt, they also attacked other nations like the Hittites and the Syrians. So there's an idea that the Sea Peoples were responsible for the Bronze Age collapse. In other words, these attacks from the Sea Peoples caused this great societal collapse of these nations around the Eastern Mediterranean. That's a common idea. But on the other hand, in more recent years, there's been a shift in thinking, which is generally that the Bronze Age collapse was caused not by attacks from nations, but rather from a kind of economic or environmental breakdown, such as through famines, through disease. But in any case, there's this idea that it may well have been environmental effects which caused the collapse of these great nations, and that the Sea Peoples, the raids of the Sea Peoples, were actually just a symptom of the Bronze Age collapse and not a cause of it. In other words, the same things, same factors that were causing these nations to collapse also caused the Sea Peoples to start raiding, because they themselves were suffering from the same issues that were affecting these other nations. So whereas these other nations just collapsed where they were, the nations that composed the Sea Peoples took to the sea to engage in raiding to try to sustain themselves because of the same problems, generally environmental problems, that were affecting these other better known nations of the Eastern Mediterranean. So they were a symptom, the Sea Peoples were a symptom of it, not a cause of the Bronze Age collapse. That's a common idea today. But which idea actually is better supported by the evidence? Were they a cause of the Bronze Age collapse, or were they a symptom of it? Well, in this video, we're going to have a look at the evidence, because the evidence really is very clear on this point. So let's have a look. First of all, to understand this, we need to understand what exactly is the Bronze Age collapse, to be able to understand whether the Sea Peoples were a cause or symptom of it. So there were three major civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age. So there was Mycenaean Greece, there was the Hittite Empire, and there was the Egyptian New Kingdom. So in terms of these three major civilizations, Mycenaean Greece collapsed. It had a powerful palatial society, as in a society centered on various palaces across Greece. So these palaces were destroyed, that whole palatial system collapsed, and they fell into the Greek Dark Ages. The Hittite Empire also collapsed. This was the civilization that ruled over basically or most of Anatolia, and so this whole empire just fell into pieces, the major centers were destroyed, and various new kingdoms emerged in the power vacuum. So then we find all these other new kingdoms emerging in the Iron Age, like the Kingdom of Lydia and Phrygia and various others. As for Egypt, that fared a lot better, but it still declined severely. So the New Kingdom was the height of Egyptian power, and Egypt ruled over an empire that extended about as far as the Hittite Empire. So they ruled over the land of Canaan, and Syria was basically the frontier land between them. So Egypt had been ruling over that area, and it fared better during the Bronze Age collapse, but it still severely declined. The Bronze Age collapse is generally dated to about 1200 BCE. Now in the following century, the 12th century BCE, we find that various Egyptian garrisons in Canaan were abandoned, some of them were even destroyed, and just generally Egypt withdrew from that area, which is why in the following centuries we find the emergence of these powerful kingdoms like Israel and Judah. So Egypt severely declined as well, although it didn't collapse in the same sense that the Hittite Empire and Mycenaean Greece collapsed. It fared a lot better, but we still see a clear decline. So how do the Sea Peoples fit into this? Well, the answer is quite clear, because although it's often claimed, like I said, that the Sea Peoples were a symptom of the Bronze Age collapse, this is simply not possible. And this is very clearly not possible when we look at the records about the Sea Peoples. So the Sea Peoples are first mentioned in Egyptian records, and the first Egyptian document to mention them dates from the time of Ramesses II, that is, Ramesses the Great. So he mentions them. He specifically points to one particularly prominent group of them that we see prominently throughout the records of the Sea Peoples, the Sherden. The Sherden may well have been the inhabitants of Sardinia, but in any case, they appear as the most prominent group among the Sea Peoples in Egyptian records. So notice what the Egyptian records say about the Sherden in the time of Ramesses II. The unruly Sherden, whom no one had ever known how to combat, they came boldly sailing in their warships from the midst of the sea, none being able to withstand them. This is dated to about 1278 BCE, which is almost a full century before the Bronze Age collapse. So tell me, how could the Sea Peoples be a symptom of the Bronze Age collapse if they were already active, raiding Egypt almost a full century before that collapse occurred? That's just not possible. We see clearly that the Sea Peoples were already active. There was already this group, the Sherden, who may well have come from all the way over in Sardinia, but in any case, they are identifiable as this group active in Egypt or near Egypt, attacking the land of the Egyptians as early as the early part of the 13th century BCE. So we know that they were already engaging in their raiding activities in the Eastern Mediterranean well before the Bronze Age collapse. This isn't ambiguous. This isn't open to interpretation. They were definitely active, raiding Egypt before the Bronze Age collapse. Now, it's true, after that they disappear for a while, for about half a century. So it's not like they engaged in continuous attacks from that time onwards. They didn't. But the point is, they were present. The nation existed, obviously. But the point is, they were active as raiders attacking Egypt long before the Bronze Age collapse. But then, half a century later, in the final quarter of the 13th century BCE, right through to the first quarter of the following century, the 12th century, we find that they were consistently and persistently attacking Egypt as powerful raiders. So there's no doubt whatsoever that they preceded the Bronze Age collapse and were active as raiders attacking Egypt during the Bronze Age collapse. So there's no doubt whatsoever they were not a symptom of the Bronze Age collapse. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they caused the Bronze Age collapse. They may well not have done. It may well have been due to environmental factors or some kind of economic breakdown. It could have been. That's really an issue for another video. But the point is, the Sea Peoples definitely weren't a symptom of it. They may not have caused it, but they weren't caused by it either. However, it is interesting though when we note, what exactly is the Bronze Age collapse? What do we mean by that? What are the traces in the archaeological record that we collectively define as the Bronze Age collapse? Well, one key element of it is, of course, the destruction of the major power centers, such as in the realm of the Hittites. And we know from the Ugaritic texts, which come from Syria but deal with events involving the Hittites, that the Sea Peoples were attacking the Hittites in the first quarter of the 12th century BCE. And this corresponds exactly with when the archaeological evidence shows the destruction of various major cities in that area. So there's no doubt, really no reasonable doubt, that it was the Sea Peoples who caused these destructions. And since it's the fall of these major power centers, which is part of what is collectively described as the Bronze Age collapse, then that would mean that the Sea Peoples did cause at least that element of the Bronze Age collapse. Not that they caused the Bronze Age collapse as a whole, but that particular element, the fall of those major power centers in the land of the Hittites, which was part of the fall of the Hittite Empire, yes, the evidence suggests that they did cause that. And as for the Egyptian withdrawal from the land of Canaan, so the shrinking of the Egyptian Empire, well, again, that can probably be at least partly attributed to the Sea Peoples. We know that the Sea Peoples were attacking the Egyptians. We have no other evidence of any major persistent attacks against the Egyptians in that era, the final part of the 13th century through to the first part of the 12th century, the only attested, persistent major attacks against the Egyptians at that time, just before when we see this massive decline of the Egyptian empire, are the attacks from the Sea Peoples. So there's no other candidate for an explanation as to why this Egyptian empire suddenly collapsed. Who was attacking the Egyptian garrisons in the land of Canaan at that time? Why did they abandon their control over that land just after they had finally managed to defeat the Sea Peoples in 1178? Could it not be that the Sea Peoples caused a massive strain on the Egyptians, on the Egyptian army, the Egyptian economy, all the effort that they had put into defeating them? I mean, that certainly seems plausible. Granted, in the case of the Egyptians, that's not necessarily the only possibility, because there's also historical evidence of the Israelites engaged in campaigns at that time as well. But that's a little bit more complex, because it's unclear to what degree they were attacking the Egyptians rather than the Canaanite kings who served the Egyptians, so that's a bit more complex. But certainly it seems reasonable to at least partially attribute the decline of Egyptian control over Canaan to the Sea Peoples who had just been attacking them persistently. That would certainly make a lot of sense, even if we can't confirm it more directly like we can in the case of the collapse of the Hittite Empire. Now, as for the fall of Mycenaean Greece, well, that's a very different kind of thing. That definitely doesn't seem to be attributable to the Sea Peoples. Maybe partially, but the thing is, it seems that the Greeks themselves actually made up the Sea Peoples. They were one of those nations. But obviously the Greeks, aren't just a monolithic entity, so maybe there were groups of Greeks working with other nations, attacking the main part of the Greeks. Who knows? That's more of a complex issue. But the point of this video is to emphasize that the Sea Peoples were definitely not a symptom of the Bronze Age collapse, as so many people love to say today. That's just not a sustainable idea. There's no justification for that idea whatsoever. The Sea Peoples appear in the records well before the Bronze Age collapse, and then they appear right before it, consistently attacking these nations as it started to happen. So they were definitely a contributing factor. Not the only factor, surely, but definitely a contributing factor and not a symptom of it. Now, let me leave you with this question. Did the Celtic invasion of Britain really happen? Well, if you'd like to find out the answer, then come back next time for my next video.